The Western philosophical tradition contains within it many great thinkers, such as the likes of, but not exclusive to, Saint Thomas Aquinas, René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, Hegel, etc. But few thinkers within this Western tradition can be said to have had as much impact, especially after their passing, especially after their life, that the great German philosopher of note, Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche is an interesting character to read into, not only because of the fact that his personal life betrays this kind of notion that he projected very much, or he was a person guilty of projection, not only in his philosophical writings but in his theories and ideas. But the sheer ferocity and intensity of the way that he wrote and his bluntness can be said to set him apart from many other great philosophers within this Western tradition. This video primarily focuses on Friedrich Nietzsche's book Human or Too Human. And in this book, Friedrich Nietzsche touches upon how human beings have constantly crafted certain sciences and certain disciplines in their own interest. And he also demonstrates the pitiful yet very human aspect in the development of these various disciplines of humanity. Now, to be clear, I don't support everything that Nietzsche says. As a man who has his sympathies for classical metaphysics and philosophy, alongside having sympathies for religious thought, I definitely don't agree with many of Nietzsche's conclusions regarding religion, for example, or classical philosophy. However, there's no doubting in the genius of the man, even if you don't agree with all the things he says. And furthermore, it is of benefit from time to time to read the works and still benefit from people or intellectuals who we don't always agree with, or who may have opposing ideas to us. Some passages of note that I thought were worth sharing are as follows. One passage that specifically struck me was that yet everything evolved. There are no eternal facts as there are no absolute truths. Accordingly, historical philosophizing is henceforth indispensable, and with it honesty of judgment. This demonstrates the first point that I made, that all of the human sciences and all of the various humanly disciplines that have developed over the thousands of years of mankind's history have been evolutions and developments and not static forces. There is a sense of continuity in many of these sciences, such as in, let's say, perhaps theology, where religious theologians would contend that they have preserved or have codified the teachings of the founders of those religions. There's also a vast sense of change within many of these sciences. For example, the social sciences, even though people have argued that the likes of Ibn Khaldun, for example, founded these sciences, which is true without doubt to an extent, because Ibn Khaldun set the foundation for many of the principles of social science. But social science as a proper field of as a proper discipline of study that is carried out by academia on an institutional basis really only emerges 100 to 150 years ago. The reality, though, is that all the human disciplines are constantly evolving institutions, and ultimately they are human crafts that reflect human interests. This doesn't necessarily mean that these institutions are false, neither that they are inherently true. Rather, it's simply a basic fact that we have to acknowledge, that all of these disciplines and institutions are not stagnant, static developments, but rather constantly evolving institutions that are developing and adapting. Nietzsche then derives from this the point that there are no eternal facts as there are no absolute truths. Because if the nature of these sciences is constantly changing, and with that, the basic assumptions that, let's say, said discipline was based upon in one era changes as they head into another era, then none of even the very basic assumptions that we can make about these sciences necessarily holds true. Thomas Kuhn, for example, points out that natural science is very much based on paradigm shifts, and the idea that one dominant paradigm is questioned and falsified to the extent where it's no longer considered a valid paradigm, and hence is replaced by another paradigm. This raises an interesting point as to what can perhaps be considered a science. Thomas Kuhn was undecisive regarding whether sociology, for example, or the social sciences should be categorized as natural sciences, because these sciences do not have a dominant paradigm or framework under which they operate, but rather there are many competing theories within them. A few important questions also arise regarding whether what we know to be true or claim to know to be true is actually true. Now, whilst I don't agree with the postmodernist take that there is no truth, because it's contradictory and self-defeating claim, because ultimately saying that there is no truth is a claim to truth which contradicts the first statement, and it's a paradoxical statement. And in reality, there is an extra mental reality that is distinguished from mere mental imaginations or mere illusionary reality, and our actions do have very real-world effects. And it would be ridiculous to assert that the world out there doesn't exist as it does. We can observe it, we can touch it, so there is some basic sense of objective truth out there. And one may ask that how do we know that our senses are valid? Well, we don't always know that our senses are correct, but we can know through the intellect that when our senses err and when our senses don't err. If someone was to say that, well, how do we know that the intellect is correct? We would say that we would resort to sound reasoning via the rules of logic and philosophical first principles to found our worldview on. And so the intellect, these foundational principles, a priori truths, which are known in and of themselves, are true by their very essence, in that it's not the case that these are laws that are established by mankind that humans make up. Rather, they are laws that are discovered and are universally always true. As such, we base our worldview off these first a priori philosophical truths. The issue that a lot of perhaps philosophers within the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment era fell into was to view these a priori truths as unfounded, whereas in reality they were true by virtue of the fact that they were real in and of themselves. For example, many people have doubted the validity of cause and effect relationship, and they asserted that this was simply perhaps us projecting our understanding of the world onto the real world. But the reality is that there's no way of understanding the world other than through a cause and effect relationship framework. And cause and effect relationship, it is not a superimposition of what we think about how the world works. It's simply a description of how we have observed the world to work. It's simply a description of why A leads to B and B leads to C, and why these events occur in tandem. So we aren't making these things up, we're simply making apparent these laws. They exist in and of themselves, true in and of themselves. It's not a figment of human imagination because it has an extra mental reality. Yet what can be taken as a benefit from Nietzsche's work, even if you don't agree with the fact that there is no truth, is that the truth does exist, but it is very complicated to know it, and there is a lot of nuance that goes into it. And it may be the case that we can only gain glimpses of the truth, and perhaps not the whole truth. We see throughout human history that man has fought over religion, in the modern age over secular humanist ideology, perhaps in the medieval age especially between the monotheistic faiths, in the past between different pagan cultures and traditions, and all of these individuals genuinely fought for what they believed in. It's not fair, and it's quite naive actually to think that they were part of some big conspiracy to get rid of the truth, or that they were just devils in the disguise of human beings. These were people who genuinely believed in what they believed in. They had reasons for why they believed in what they believed in. Some for rational reasons, other for spiritual reasons, other for emotional reasons, other because their community or families agreed with these viewpoints, or because they found solace in these viewpoints. It's very difficult then to assert that one side was evil and the other side was just very good. And so we see throughout human history that good, honest, hard-working, thoughtful people, intellectual people, brave people, have been divided by religion and politics and all sorts of different things. And then it's difficult to know which of these groups in many cases may have been right. So ultimately there is always some sort of dispute regarding the truth. There is always a difference of opinion. And hence, what may make sense to one person may make absolutely no sense to another person. Everybody has their own reasons as to what they believe in, and in that sense, if we were to take a more socio-hermeneutical approach to Nietzsche's work, a more social commentary type approach to Nietzsche's work, then this statement makes a lot more sense. That there is no absolute truth because of the fact that humans throughout history have disagreed regarding these very basic absolute truths. And this disagreement has had very real effects, for millions and tens of thousands of people have died fighting over these absolute truths which they themselves may have disagreed over.